Hi, Greg Hughes here from 90-Second Website Builder. This video is about the Layer tool. It's a very common tool that you'll use in building websites. If you go to the Layout section of the toolbox, one of your options is the Layer tool. I'm going to click on the Layer tool and just draw one out here on the canvas. A layer is simply a container. In HTML terms, we would call it a div tag. But a layer can contain objects. In fact, just about any object you can place on a web page, you can put into a layer, whether it's text, images, video. Even form objects can go into a layer. Now, a layer can have its own attributes, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the purpose of a layer is for it to contain a section of your web page. Most web pages are built on layers, especially if you make your header out of a layer and then maybe your navigation bar might go into a layer. A content area would be in its own layer. Of course, you don't have to do it this way, but it is a great way to do it. It keeps things in order and contained well. Your footer would be its own layer. And that's usually what you would do in designing a website. So layers are incredibly important, but let's just kind of take a look at them in this next section here. I'm going to double click on the layer to show you some of the configuration or attributes that a layer can have. First, you need to know that there are many kinds of layers, and we're working with one that's just the simple default layer. Each of these other layer modes or layer types would actually require their own video because it gets pretty extensive. So to keep this video succinct and easy to watch, we're going to just talk about the default simple layer. Layers have their own style. They can have their own backgrounds, whether it be a solid color, images, gradients, textures, even video can be in the background of a layer. Also, layers have their own borders if you want, and they can be solid, just about any look you can think of, color, how round the edges are, how wide that border is. Layers can have shadows. You set the blurriness, the color, and the offset, and that layer can have a shadow. You can also associate layers with events, animation, like I said, make it a form, or use it in a bookmark. In one sense, it's like any other object you put on the page, except that it is a container that has a very specific purpose. I'm going to change the color of the background of this layer to a little bit darker color so you can see it better in the video. So I've just made it a solid gray. And so here is my layer. Let's do a quick preview. I'm going to click F5 so we can look at what this looks like in a browser. So here's my web page with a simple layer. And as you can see, it doesn't do much of anything. It's just a box that can contain something. That's what it would look like. So now let's do some things with this layer. As I said, we can put objects into it. So I'm going to put an image in this layer. So let me go to the image tool and we'll just drag a box out here. And let's find Facebook logo. Now here's an image next to the layer. If I want to put this image inside the layer, I just drag into it. Now watch what happens as soon as the image is fully inside the layer. You'll see that it lit up. You can see that there is a blue border around the layer. That means the object is now fully inside the layer when it looks like that. If I do this, that object is not inside the layer. It's not part of it. When it is inside the layer, it moves with it and is contained by it. That's an important but simple principle because as you're working with layers, you want to make sure that your objects are fully inside. If this is out even by 1 pixel, it's no longer part of the layer. So as I said, a layer can contain just about anything. The other thing that I like to do with my layers is I like to use them for building my website pretty much from top to bottom. And I like to fill the page. And so I'm going to show you how I do that. I'm going to put this layer in the upper left corner. And let's say I wanted this to be my header. Well, one thing I could do is just kind of stretch it out over here. And it looks like a pretty good header. So let's press F5 and see what that looks like in a browser. Well, in a browser, it does kind of look like a header, but it's not great because it doesn't come all the way over to the edge of the page. Just kind of a big gray box in the corner. So how do we fix that? I'll show you. This is where the settings are really important. What I like to do with my layers is I like to choose something that's called relative horizontal sizing. That means I want the layer to be relative horizontally to the size of my browser. And that way it will fill the full width of the browser no matter how wide it is. It's sort of a responsive design principle built into layers. I also like to center the content of my layer. Now watch this. We're going to click OK. We're going to preview by clicking F5 and you'll see the difference. Now my layer fills the page much better. No matter how wide I stretch my browser, you'll see that the layer fills it from side to side. Also, if I stretch really far, you'll notice that the logo that I have, or the Facebook logo that I have, is moving, and that's because I chose to center the contents of my layer. So that's the more common way that you might use a layer, by simply making it relative horizontal sizing, centering the contents, and using it for your website. Again, you could use it for a header, you could use it for storing your navigation bar, or you might use it as a footer or just the content area of your website. So that's sort of layer 101, the basics. I want to talk to you about some other things that layers do. So I'm going to delete this layer and bring up one that I made earlier. So here's another layer that I actually use on my website. And this one has some text objects. There's an object here, one here, and one here, 3 different text objects. This is an object called a card, sort of a bootstrap card. This layer, I'm going to double click on it so you can see what I've done. Again, I'm using the default mode, relative horizontal sizing. It's centered. The style is just simply a white solid background. Click OK. Let's see what this looks like in the browser. So when I preview, you can see that my layer is now full width. That white band goes all the way across full width because it's relative horizontal sizing, and because it's centered, the content moves with it and stays in the center of my browser. So again, that's the simple use of a layer, the most common use. Let's talk about a couple more things we can do with layers. Now, I made another layer down here. I'm going to drag it up into the screen. In fact, let's go like this and lower the camera a little bit so you can see it better. This is also a layer. This is a layer that has a background. Let's double click on it and I'll show you what I mean. Here I have a layer, again, relative horizontal sizing, and it's centering, but my style is different. My style is actually an image. So instead of going with a solid color, I chose image, and then I clicked this button and went and found the image on my website that I want to show and ended up with this image. And let's take a look at some of the things we can do. By the way, remember, I can put anything I want into a layer, which means that if I drag an object into it, it still sits in the layer, and this photograph is the background, right? So I can put text, images inside this layer all I want. The other thing I should note too is when using relative horizontal sizing, you'll notice that the width of my layer is actually set at the same as the width of my page. I'm using a 1200 pixel wide page. And so if I'm going to use relative horizontal sizing, I need to make sure that my layer is set to the same width, 1200. One of the ways you can do that is just by selecting it and going down to the Properties Inspector and making sure that the width of your layer is set to the right width. That's important for using relative horizontal sizing. Anyway, back to the background with the pretty picture here. I want to show you some really interesting things about using layers with photographs in the background. We have some options under a setting called size. And right now we're not using any of these settings. It's just defaulting to this picture. But if I choose one called cover, click OK, and then you'll notice it shifted a little bit, or maybe you didn't notice it because it was kind of subtle. I'm going to click F5 to preview this to show you what cover does when we use it in the background of a layer. So here I'm viewing the web page again. Let me bring it up here so you can see it a little bit better. What's going to happen is I'm going to reduce the width of my browser and watch what happens to this image. You may have noticed that this image is actually scaling so that it covers, because that's what we're using, cover, so that it covers the background no matter how wide my browser window is. Now, that's really a great effect. And this, by the way, is one of the more common uses of the background photograph. You're going to usually use this setting called cover. There are some other settings that do different things, but this is the one you'll probably use most often. Let's look at those other settings though. Closing the preview, double clicking on the layer, I go to Style, and let's change from cover to contain. Contain is almost the opposite of what cover does. You'll notice that instead of covering the whole fill of the layer, it actually just gets contained. It will only be as big as the image allows. And because of the size of this original image, it has to repeat. So I'm choosing contain. So if we click OK, do an F5, you'll see that this is a different effect. This time, it's not going to scale. It's completely static until we get to the actual size of the original image, and then it will scale down. I know that's a little bit complicated, but rather than know how it does all that, it's important to know that it does all that so you'll know which effect to use. But this is the difference between just contain and cover. And again, cover is the one you're most likely going to use in these scenarios. There are some others. So that was cover and contain. Parallax is really fun. Parallax is a whole different effect all in and of itself. You'll notice that the photograph filled the background. I'm going to click F5. Parallax allows us to get that really cool effect you see on a lot of websites these days, where the background image of the layer moves at a different pace than the rest of the website. I'm scrolling down through the page here, and you'll see that it has sort of this three-dimensional feel. That's called a parallax. Very easy to do in 90-second website builder. Again, all I did was I chose a background image and clicked the parallax box. I happen to be using it as relative horizontal sizing too, and so it really looks good when filling the web page, filling the browser page like that. That's parallax. Then we move on to the next section here. We can also choose to fill this at 100%, and we can change these numbers if we want to. It defaults to 100. You could do 90 or 50 or 42 or whatever you want. So we can fill it at 100% by 100%. And what that does is it sort of, depending on the quality of your picture and the content of the picture, it just sets the layer to be filled with the original size of the image by scrunching it if it has to, or by stretching it if it has to. It goes 100%. Some pictures, this won't work well for because it sort of makes them look too scrunched and you don't want them to. And in this case, you'll notice the image that I used is really not a great use of this particular setting, because as I change the size of the browser width, it gets sort of pixelated and out of scale. And this would only work if you were using, say, some kind of a pattern background for your photograph, rather than using a photograph that has this kind of content. This is not a great use for that setting. But there are times and there are applications where you're going to want to use that 100% fill. You can also, instead of doing it in percentages, you can do it in actual pixel sizes. And this is set for 50/50. You can make this be any number of pixels you want. And this will make, well, it'll do this. It'll make a lot of little 50 by 50 pixel pictures of your background. A lot of options there. Some of them are rarer to use than others. Again, you're most likely going to use either nothing or cover. And in this case, I'm using cover so that it scales with the background. Sometimes when you're using an image, here's another layer I have down here where I'm actually using a person's face. And so sometimes you don't want to use an effect that would make that face get too narrow or too wide, because it looks funny on a person. And so the content of your photograph really matters. I'll show you. Here we have a background photo. We're using an image for a background, and it's on cover because that's going to look the best. If we preview this, you can see that no matter what we do to the web page, or rather the browser width, the web page is going to respond well without distorting this girl's face. And that's probably what we would want to do. That will help us with our responsive design flow. If we chose something that would work better with, say, a pattern background, it's going to kind of mess her face up a little bit. Let's see what contain does. Well, see, contain's not going to be great because the image size, the original image size, doesn't work so good for that. If I use contain, I'm going to have to deal with that little extra piece of image like this. That doesn't work because of the particular size of the image that I'm working with. I end up with sort of that split. And also, you'll notice again, it doesn't scale here. It only scales once we get to the actual size of the image, like that. Different effect altogether, not something I'd want to use for this particular picture. We could use it as a parallax, that'll be fine. 100%, this is where it will get scrunchy. In fact, it just made the picture a little bit wider because this picture is not normally 1200 pixels wide. It had to stretch it out a little bit, but it doesn't do the photograph of this girl any justice because it changes the width of her face. So it would look like this, and as we change the width of the browser, it just gets too narrow. We don't want her to have a skinny head like that or a really wide one like that. So again, my point is the content of your photograph is going to determine which of these style effects you want to use. It will usually be cover, parallax, or nothing at all. I'll leave this at cover. We could talk about a lot of other things with layers, but they warrant their own video. So for now, I'm going to wrap this video up, but I'm just going to do a quick overview of the different modes because you should know that they exist. So for example, something called the sticky layer. Sticky layer is a layer that keeps the layer visible, whether you stick it to the top, the bottom, the left, or the right, at all times. So something that would stick. There's a great use for this. There'll be a video about that. You can see how a sticky layer works. It's useful if you want to keep a menu or image visible no matter where the person scrolls down the page. That's what a sticky layer would be used for. And then there's a modal layer. A modal is a screen that sort of pops up in the center of your web page and becomes the focus of view, and everything behind it is sort of grayed out. That's a modal layer, so you can do that with the layer tool as well. Another one is a docking layer, you'll see here. A docking layer allows you to fix a layer to a specific side of the screen, or if you want to fix it to the very center of the screen. The difference between this mode and the sticky layer is that a docking layer doesn't use a JavaScript. So there's some technical differences behind that. Then there's the panel layer. A panel layer is great because it's initially invisible. The panel layer doesn't show, but it can show. In fact, it slides from either the right or the left side of the page when you're using an event. So a panel layer has to be triggered by an event, but it's a really cool effect. And again, we won't do that in this video. That's just a teaser for some of the other videos that will be available on using the layer tool. So hopefully that's a lot of information, but hopefully it will get you started understanding the importance of using the layer tool as you're building websites with 90-Second Website Builder.